London, 1966. EMI Studios, late October. It was past 2 in the morning when Jimmy Page said it. Not loud, not with anger. Just the kind of quiet confidence that comes from a man who has always believed he was right and had rarely been told otherwise. "You'll never last," Page said, half to himself, half to the room. "Not without discipline. Not the way you play." Jeff Beck didn't look up. He was sitting across the room, in the corner near the window, holding his Telecaster loosely in his lap. Not playing, just holding it. The way you hold something familiar when everything else in the room feels wrong. Nobody said anything. The session had been running for 6 hours. The Yardbirds were in the middle of recording a new track, and the arrangement kept falling apart somewhere in the third verse. The producer had called a break 20 minutes ago. The drummer had gone to find coffee. The bassist was asleep on a couch. The engineer was staring at the ceiling with the blank expression of a man who had stopped expecting the night to end. And Jimmy Page, newly arrived in the band, still finding his place, still establishing his territory, had decided that 2 in the morning was the right time to talk about professionalism. It had started earlier that day during the first playback. The engineer rolled back the tape. Everyone gathered around the monitors. And what came through the speakers was technically impressive, tight, clean, musical. But somewhere in Beck's playing, there was something that didn't fit the structure. Not a mistake exactly. More like a detour. A phrase that bent slightly off the expected path and came back from somewhere else entirely. Page had noticed it immediately. He was precise by nature. He kept notebooks with chord diagrams and arrangement sketches. He thought about music architecturally, foundations, frames, load-bearing elements. He had arrived in the Yardbirds with a clear idea of what a guitarist should be. Reliable, controlled, subordinate to the song when the song needed it. Beck was none of those things. Beck played like he was having a private conversation with the guitar. And nobody else was invited. During the break, while the tape was being rewound, Page had said something to the producer. Quiet, measured. Something about consistency. Something about professionalism. He didn't use Beck's name. He didn't need to. Beck was standing in the hallway. The door was open. He heard it. That was 4 hours ago. Now it was past 2, and the room was half empty, and Page had said it out loud. "You'll never last. Not the way you play." Beck looked up then, just briefly. His eyes went to Page, held there for a second, long enough to say something, not long enough to actually say it, and then went back down to the guitar in his lap. Page took the silence as agreement. He shouldn't have. The producer came back around 2:30, coffee in hand, and said they were going to try the third verse one more time before calling it a night. The drummer returned. The bassist woke up. The engineer sat back at the console and pulled his headphones around his neck. Beck stood up, walked to the amp in the corner, and plugged in. No ceremony, no preparation. He didn't stretch his fingers or adjust the knobs or say anything to anyone. He just stood there for a moment, guitar in hand, and then, without reaching for the pick sitting on top of the amp, he started to play. Just his fingers, thumb and fingertips against the strings. Page was standing near the doorway, arms crossed, watching Beck the way you watch something you don't entirely trust. Then Beck played the opening phrase. Same progression they'd been working on all night. Same key, same tempo. But the tone that came out of the amp was unlike anything that had filled that room in the previous 6 hours. Softer and harder at the same time. More human somehow, like the notes had been worn smooth from being held too long. Page uncrossed his arms. He didn't notice that he did it. Beck moved through the phrase slowly, deliberately, his fingers finding each note from below rather than striking it from above. Without a pick, there was no percussive attack. Only sustain, only the voice of the string as it rose and fell under pressure. The melody arrived differently, not announced, just present. The way something arrives when it's been there all along, and you finally go quiet enough to hear it. Somewhere in the second phrase, one of the overhead lights in the studio flickered. A small electrical thing that would have gone unnoticed any other moment. Nobody reacted. Nobody looked up. The room had reorganized itself around the sound coming from the amp, and nothing outside of that seemed to require attention. The engineer reached for the record button. Nobody had asked him to. Nobody told him to stop. Beck played for maybe 4 minutes. He didn't look at anyone. He wasn't performing. He was working something out, and the room just happened to be around him while he did it. When he stopped, the last note stayed in the monitors for a few seconds longer than it should have, and then the room was quiet. The drummer set down his sticks very carefully. The kind of careful that means you don't want to make a sound. The bassist was sitting forward on the couch, elbows on his knees, looking at Beck like he was trying to place a face he recognized from somewhere. The producer said nothing. He looked at the engineer. The engineer gave a small nod. The kind that doesn't mean yes or no, just, I know. Jimmy Page was still standing near the doorway. He hadn't moved. His arms were at his sides. His own guitar was leaning against the wall behind him, untouched since the break. He was watching Beck with an expression that didn't have a simple name. Not admiration exactly. Not defeat exactly. Something that lives between the two, and that most people spend their whole careers learning how to avoid feeling. Beck set the Telecaster back against the amp and picked up his jacket from the chair. "I'm done," he said, not to anyone in particular, not as a statement of anything, just the way you say it when you are, in fact, done. He left without another word. Nobody talked about what happened that night, not in any formal sense. There was no argument to resolve, no confrontation to process. The session notes listed it as a productive evening with promising material in progress. The producer noted the finger-picking arrangement as a possible direction worth exploring. The engineer kept the recording, filed it under the date, said nothing. Page went back to his flat and, by his own account years later, did not sleep. He picked up his guitar around 4 in the morning and tried to play what Beck had played. He tried it with his pick first, then without. He could find the notes. He could approximate the rhythm. But the thing Beck had done, that quality underneath the melody, that weight that made the notes feel earned rather than placed, he couldn't locate it. Not that night. He put the guitar down and sat in the dark for a while. He replayed the session in his mind. Not the argument, not the things he'd said to the producer, the 4 minutes. He tried to locate the exact moment things had shifted. The first note, the second, the point where the room had changed temperature without anyone touching a dial. He couldn't find it. The moment didn't announce itself. That was the problem. That was what he kept running into. He was 22 years old and had spent most of those years completely certain he understood what it meant to play the guitar well. He had studied. He had practiced in ways most people couldn't sustain. Hours that turned into days that turned into a kind of religion. He could look at a piece of music and see it whole, the way an architect sees a building from its blueprints before a single wall goes up. And Jeff Beck had just sat down without a pick and played something Page couldn't explain. Not couldn't copy, couldn't explain, couldn't fit inside the framework he'd spent years constructing. That bothered him more than anything else. They stayed in the band together for only a few more months. Beck left the Yardbirds at the end of 1966. The reasons were complicated: tension, exhaustion, the grinding mechanics of being on the road. Management said one thing. Beck said something slightly different. Page said very little. In the years that followed, both of them built careers that could fill separate books. Page went on to form Led Zeppelin and produce some of the most celebrated rock recordings in history. Beck formed his own groups and then dissolved them, collaborated and retreated, moved constantly between styles that didn't have names yet when he was already playing them. They crossed paths occasionally. Concerts, studios, industry evenings. The conversation between them was always civil, respectful, even warm. Beck would say something understated about Led Zeppelin. Page would say something honest about Beck's latest record. Neither of them would mention 1966. Neither of them brought up that studio, that amp, that particular night. But there was something slightly unresolved underneath it all. The way there is between two people who share a memory they've never directly mentioned to each other. In 1993, Page gave a long interview to a British music magazine. The conversation covered his early session work, the Yardbirds years, Led Zeppelin, his approach to the guitar, and how it had changed over time. Near the end, the journalist asked about Beck. Page was quiet for a moment. "Jeff plays from somewhere I don't have access to," he said finally. "I understood technique. I understood structure. Jeff understood something else. Something I couldn't name then, and honestly still can't fully name now. The journalist asked if he had felt competitive with Beck during the Yardbirds period. Page almost smiled. I thought I was ahead of him, he said. I thought I had something he didn't. Discipline, precision, a plan. He paused. Then one night in the studio, he played without a pick, and I realized I'd been counting things that didn't need to be counted. And the things that actually mattered, I wasn't even measuring them. He didn't say more than that. He didn't need to. Beck never mentioned that night in any interview. Not once. Not in passing. Not as an anecdote. Not as a memory that came up when someone asked the right question. He talked about other things. His cars, his tone, his obsession with specific amplifiers and the way different rooms changed the sound. He talked about players who had surprised him. He talked about Cliff Gallup and Les Paul and the way certain guitar sounds had lodged in him when he was young and never really left. He never talked about the studio at 2 in the morning, never mentioned the pick on top of the amp or the 4 minutes that changed the atmosphere of a room. He probably didn't think of it as a moment. That was the thing about Beck. The moments that broke other people open were, to him, just evenings, just rooms. Just another time he picked up a guitar and played the only way he knew how to play, without a plan, without a destination, without needing anyone in the room to follow where he was going, which was, in the end, the thing that made him impossible to answer. Not technique, not speed, not any quality you could name, and therefore study and therefore close the distance on. Just that, a sound that arrived without announcing itself, from a man who never felt the need to announce anything, and a pick still sitting on top of the amp that nobody remembered to put away.